The small silver key felt cold against my fingertips as I pulled it from Ryan's suit pocket. It shouldn't have been there. In 15 years of marriage, I'd never seen this key before. The tiny paper tag attached to it bore an address I didn't recognize. 1247 Maple Street, apartment 3B. But it was the way my heart stopped beating for just a moment that told me everything I needed to know. This key was going to destroy my life. My name is Jennifer, and I'm about to tell you how one small piece of metal opened a door that killed my marriage without making a single sound. Not the screaming, crying, plate-throwing kind of death you see in movies. Just the quiet, devastating click of a lock turning, revealing a truth so complete and so carefully constructed that it left no room for hope, forgiveness, or second chances. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how perfect everything seemed before it all fell apart. I'm 38 years old, and I run a successful interior design business here in Denver, Colorado. Ryan and I met in college when we were both 23, and we built what everyone thought was the perfect life together. Ryan works as a corporate finance manager for a large investment firm downtown, and he's always been the practical one in our relationship. Where I see colors and textures and possibilities, Ryan sees numbers and budgets and realistic timelines. We complemented each other perfectly. Our house is a beautiful craftsman bungalow in the Highlands neighborhood, with original hardwood floors that I refinished myself and a kitchen I designed from scratch. We have a 12-year-old daughter named Chloe who's smart, funny, and the center of both our worlds. She plays violin, excels in school, and has Ryan's analytical mind combined with my creative eye. Looking at our family from the outside, you'd see exactly what Ryan and I thought we had: a stable, loving marriage between two successful professionals who built something beautiful together. Ryan has always been predictable in the best possible way. He leaves for work at exactly 7:30 every morning, comes home by 6 p.m. unless he has a client dinner, and spends his weekends coaching Chloe's soccer team and working on home improvement projects. He's the kind of man who color codes his closet and keeps detailed spreadsheets of our household expenses. He remembers anniversaries and birthdays, brings me coffee in bed every Sunday morning, and has never given me a single reason to doubt his loyalty or honesty. Which is why finding that key felt like stepping into an alternate universe where nothing made sense anymore. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and I was doing what I'd done 1,000 times before, gathering Ryan's dry cleaning to take in the next morning. He had 3 suits that needed pressing, and I always check the pockets before dropping them off. Usually, I find nothing more interesting than receipts, business cards, or the occasional mint. But this time, my fingers closed around something that didn't belong. The key was small and brass-colored, the kind that opens a simple door lock rather than anything expensive or secure. But it was the address tag that made my blood run cold. 1247 Maple Street was clear across town from our house, in a part of Denver I rarely visited. There was no reason for Ryan to have a key to an address I'd never heard him mention. My first thought was completely innocent. Maybe it was a key to a client's office, or a friend's place, or some kind of business property Ryan was helping evaluate for his company. But then I realized that Ryan tells me everything about his work. He comes home every night with stories about difficult clients, interesting projects, and office politics. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never mentioned anyone or anything connected to Maple Street. My second thought was darker but still manageable. Maybe Ryan was planning some kind of surprise for an upcoming anniversary. Maybe he'd rented a space for a party or bought an investment property as a gift. It would be unlike him to make such a major financial decision without discussing it with me first, but people do strange things when they're trying to be romantic. But as I stood there in our bedroom, holding that key and staring at the unfamiliar address, a sick feeling began growing in my stomach. Because there was a third possibility, one that I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. The possibility that my predictable, honest, devoted husband was living some kind of double life. I sat on the edge of our bed and tried to think of any reasonable explanation for why Ryan would have a key to an apartment across town that he'd never mentioned to me. I went through our recent conversations, looking for any reference to Maple Street or anyone who might live there. I thought about his recent behavior, searching for signs that something had changed. That's when I realized that things had been different lately, but so subtly that I'd barely noticed. Ryan had been working late more frequently over the past few months. He'd started taking phone calls in his car instead of in the house, claiming he needed privacy for sensitive client conversations. He'd been more distracted during dinner, less present during our weekend family time, and he'd stopped initiating the intimate conversations that had always been such an important part of our relationship. None of these changes had been dramatic enough to trigger alarm bells. Ryan's job really did require occasional late nights and confidential phone calls. But now, holding this mysterious key, I realized that all these small changes might not have been about work at all. I wanted to confront Ryan immediately, to simply ask him about the key and give him a chance to explain. But something held me back. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was the interior designer in me who'd learned never to make major decisions based on incomplete information. Either way, I decided that before I said anything to my husband, I needed to know what door this key opened. The next morning, I waited until Ryan left for work and Chloe was safely at school. Then I drove across Denver to 1247 Maple Street, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The address led me to a modest apartment complex in a middle-class neighborhood I'd only driven through a few times. The building was well-maintained but unremarkable, the kind of place where young professionals and small families live quietly without attracting attention. Apartment 3B was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled like cleaning products and someone's dinner from the night before. I stood outside the door for a full 5 minutes, holding the key and trying to convince myself to use it. Part of me hoped it wouldn't work, that this was all some bizarre misunderstanding, and I'd drive home feeling foolish but relieved. But the key slid into the lock like it belonged there, and when I turned it, the door opened with that soft, final click that I'll remember for the rest of my life, the sound of my marriage ending. What I found inside that apartment was worse than an affair. It was evidence of a complete alternate life that Ryan had been building without my knowledge. The furniture was modern and expensive, nothing like the traditional pieces we'd chosen together for our family home. The kitchen was stocked with gourmet coffee and wine that Ryan claimed to dislike. The bedroom had silk sheets in a color Ryan always said was too feminine for his taste. But it was the details that made me sick to my stomach. There were framed photographs on the nightstand showing Ryan with a woman I'd never seen before, both of them smiling with the easy intimacy of a long-term couple. In the photos, Ryan was wearing clothes I'd never seen him wear, and a confident expression that looked foreign on his face. The woman was beautiful, in a polished, professional way, with dark hair and a smile that reached her eyes when she looked at my husband. On the dresser, I found a small velvet box containing a men's wedding ring that wasn't the one I'd placed on Ryan's finger 15 years ago. Next to it was a woman's ring, elegant and expensive, that clearly belonged to whoever lived here with him. In the closet, Ryan's clothes hung next to women's clothing in a size that definitely wasn't mine. There were suits I'd never seen, casual clothes that weren't his style, and even a coffee mug in the kitchen with "World's Best Boyfriend" printed on the side. This wasn't just an affair. This was a carefully constructed second life, complete with its own identity, its own relationship, and its own future. Ryan wasn't just cheating on me. He was actively building an exit strategy from our marriage, and he was doing it so methodically that I might never have discovered it if I hadn't found that key. I spent 2 hours in that apartment, going through every room, every drawer, every piece of evidence that my husband had been living a lie for months, or possibly years. I found receipts for dinners at restaurants Ryan had never taken me to, tickets to shows he'd claimed not to be interested in, and even a lease agreement showing that he'd been paying rent on this place for 8 months. 8 months. While I'd been planning our family vacation and discussing Chloe's college fund, Ryan had been building a completely separate life with someone else. While I'd been trusting him completely and never questioning his late nights or weekend errands, he'd been investing our money and his time in a relationship that made our marriage look like nothing more than an inconvenience he was planning to discard. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though that felt like a physical wound in my chest. The worst part was realizing how thoroughly I'd been fooled. Ryan hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been living as a completely different person whenever he walked through the door of apartment 3B. The man in those photographs, wearing clothes I'd never seen and smiling in ways I didn't recognize, was a stranger who happened to share my husband's face. I left the apartment exactly as I'd found it and drove home in a daze. Ryan was still at work, and Chloe wouldn't be home from school for hours, so I had time to process what I'd discovered. But processing seemed impossible when the foundation of my entire adult life had just been revealed as a carefully constructed fiction. That evening, Ryan came home at his usual time, kissed me on the cheek like he always did, and asked about my day with the same pleasant interest he'd shown for 15 years. I watched him interact with Chloe over dinner, helping her with homework and listening to her stories about school, and I realized that this version of Ryan, the devoted father and husband, might be just as much of a performance as whatever role he played in that apartment across town. For 3 days, I said nothing. I went about our normal routine while my mind raced through questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Who was the woman in the photographs? Did Ryan love her? Or was she just part of some elaborate plan I couldn't understand? Was he planning to leave me? Or was he content to live this double life indefinitely? But most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, but I also couldn't confront Ryan without a plan. If he was capable of maintaining such an elaborate deception, he was certainly capable of lying his way out of my accusations or manipulating the situation to his advantage. I needed more than just the evidence of the apartment. I needed to understand the full scope of what he'd been doing and protect myself and Chloe from whatever was coming next. That's when I made the decision that would determine how this story ended. Instead of confronting Ryan immediately, I was going to investigate further. I was going to learn everything there was to know about his secret life, and then I was going to make sure that when the truth finally came out, I would be the one in control of the situation. I started with the financial records. Ryan handled most of our investments and bill paying, but I had access to all our accounts through online banking. What I discovered made me physically nauseous. Over the past 8 months, Ryan had been systematically withdrawing money from our joint savings account and our daughter's college fund. Small amounts at first, but gradually increasing to the point where he'd taken nearly $40,000 without my knowledge. The money had been transferred to accounts I'd never heard of, and when I traced the transactions, I discovered that Ryan had opened several new credit cards and a separate checking account using our home address but without my name attached. He'd been building a financial infrastructure that would allow him to disappear from our life without leaving himself broke or desperate. But it got worse. When I dug deeper into the credit card statements, I found charges for things that made no sense in the context of our life together. Expensive dinners for 2 at restaurants Ryan claimed not to like, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never heard of, weekend trips to places Ryan had never mentioned visiting, even rent payments for the apartment on Maple Street, which meant he'd been using our family's money to fund his affair. I also discovered something that terrified me even more than the affair itself. Ryan had been using his company credit card for personal expenses and then paying it back with money stolen from our accounts. This wasn't just marital infidelity. It was financial fraud that could result in criminal charges if his employer discovered what he'd been doing. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was stealing from me, from our daughter's future, and from his own company to support a relationship that was apparently so important to him that he was willing to risk everything for it. The next step was finding out who the woman in the photographs was. I took pictures of her with my phone when I returned to the apartment, and my friend Alex, who's a professional photographer with contacts throughout the Denver art and business communities, was able to identify her within 2 days. Her name was Grace Morrison, and she worked as a marketing coordinator for a company in the same downtown office complex as Ryan's firm. She was 35, divorced, with no children, and according to Alex's research, she'd been single for about a year before she started appearing in social media posts with Ryan. What disturbed me most was that Grace's online presence showed a woman who believed she was in a committed relationship with a man who was available and honest about his feelings for her. In other words, Ryan wasn't just lying to me. He was lying to Grace too, letting her believe that he was free to build a future with her while he was still married and living with his family every night. Grace appeared to be as much a victim of Ryan's deception as I was, just in a different way. This realization changed everything for me. I'd been prepared to hate the other woman, to blame her for destroying my marriage and stealing my husband. But looking at Grace's social media posts, reading her captions about finally finding someone who gets me and building something real with the love of my life, I realized that she had no idea she was dating a married man with a daughter and a secret, a life. Ryan had been lying so completely to both of us that neither Grace nor I had any idea who he really was or what he was really doing. We were both in love with carefully constructed versions of the same man, and neither version was real. I spent another week gathering evidence and trying to understand the full scope of Ryan's deception. I photographed financial documents, copied transaction records, and even hired a private investigator to confirm details about Grace and the timeline of their relationship. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been planning his exit from our marriage for almost a year, methodically building a new life while systematically draining the resources from his old one. The private investigator also discovered something that forced me to act immediately. Ryan had been meeting with a divorce attorney for the past month, apparently preparing to file papers that would paint me as an unstable wife and unfit mother. He was planning to claim that I'd been mentally unstable and financially irresponsible, and he wanted primary custody of Chloe, along with the majority of our shared assets. In other words, Ryan wasn't just planning to leave me, he was planning to destroy me legally and financially while taking our daughter away from me. The man I'd trusted with my life and my heart was preparing to claim that I was the problem in our marriage and that he deserved to start fresh with our child and our money. That's when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to end the charade and take control of the situation before Ryan could execute whatever plan he'd been developing with his attorney. But I wasn't going to confront him alone, and I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to spin the situation in his favor. I called Detective Adam Curtis at the Denver Police Department and explained that I'd discovered evidence of financial fraud involving my husband's embezzlement of company funds and theft from our joint accounts. I provided him with copies of all the documentation I'd gathered, including proof that Ryan had been using his corporate credit card for personal expenses and stealing money from our family accounts to fund his double life. Detective Curtis was immediately interested, especially when I explained that Ryan worked for a major investment firm and had access to significant financial resources that he appeared to be misusing. White-collar financial crimes were taken very seriously, and the amount of money involved was substantial enough to warrant a full investigation. I also contacted an attorney of my own, someone who specialized in complex divorce cases involving financial fraud. My lawyer advised me to freeze all our joint accounts immediately and to document everything I'd discovered before Ryan realized his secret life had been exposed. Then I did something that I knew would end my marriage forever, but that I also knew was the only way to protect myself and Chloe from the man Ryan had apparently become. I arranged to meet Detective Curtis at the apartment on Maple Street, and together we waited for Ryan to arrive for what his text messages indicated was a romantic evening with Grace. Ryan walked into that apartment at 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday, carrying flowers and wearing the confident smile I'd seen in all those photographs. He was so focused on his anticipation of seeing Grace that he didn't notice Detective Curtis and me sitting in the living room until he'd already closed the door behind him. The look on Ryan's face when he saw me was something I'll never forget. It wasn't surprise or guilt or even fear. It was rage. Pure, cold rage that I'd discovered his carefully constructed secret and dared to intrude on the life he'd built for himself. "What the hell are you doing here, Jennifer?" he demanded, apparently forgetting that Detective Curtis was also present. "I could ask you the same thing, Ryan," I replied calmly, "but I think we both know why you're here. The question is, are you ready to explain to Detective Curtis why you've been stealing from our family and your company to pay for this apartment?" That's when Ryan noticed the police officer and realized that this wasn't just a marital confrontation. This was a criminal investigation, and all his careful planning was about to collapse and around him. Detective Curtis stood up and introduced himself. "Mr. Hayes, we need to talk about some financial irregularities that have come to our attention. Specifically, your unauthorized use of company credit cards and the systematic withdrawal of funds from accounts belonging to your wife and daughter." Ryan's confident facade crumbled immediately. He looked back and forth between Detective Curtis and me, and I could see him trying to calculate whether he could lie his way out of the situation or if he was already trapped by the evidence I'd gathered. "I don't know what Jennifer has told you," Ryan said carefully, "but this is obviously a domestic dispute that got out of hand. My wife is upset about some personal issues in our marriage, and she's trying to make it into something criminal." Detective Curtis pulled out a folder containing copies of all the financial documents I'd provided. "Mr. Hayes, we have bank records showing unauthorized transfers from joint accounts, credit card statements documenting personal charges to your company card, and receipts proving you've been using stolen funds to pay rent on this apartment. This isn't a domestic dispute. This is fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft." That's when the door opened and Grace walked in, clearly expecting a romantic evening with the man she thought was her devoted boyfriend. Instead, she found Ryan being questioned by a police detective while his wife sat calmly in the living room of what she'd believed was their shared sanctuary. "Ryan?" Grace said uncertainly. "What's going on? Who are these people?" I stood up and extended my hand to her. "Grace, my name is Jennifer Hayes. I'm Ryan's wife of 15 years, and this is Detective Curtis. I think we all need to have a conversation about who my husband really is." The next hour was one of the most surreal of my life. Detective Curtis questioned Ryan while Grace and I sat together on the couch, both of us trying to understand how completely we'd been deceived. Grace was devastated when she realized that Ryan was married with a child, but she was also angry that he'd used her to commit crimes that could have destroyed her career and reputation. It turned out that Grace had unwittingly helped Ryan with some of his financial schemes, believing she was assisting with legitimate business transactions. Ryan had used her name on some of the fraudulent accounts and had even convinced her to sign documents she thought were related to their shared future together. Grace had no idea she'd been participating in criminal activity, but her signatures were on paperwork that made her look like an accomplice. Ryan was arrested that night and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and identity theft. The investigation revealed that he'd stolen over $60,000 from various sources, including his company, our family accounts, and even Chloe's college fund. He'd been planning to disappear with Grace to another state, leaving me to deal with the financial wreckage and the legal consequences of his crimes. But his plan fell apart because of one small detail he'd overlooked. He'd been so focused on building his exit strategy that he'd gotten careless with the evidence, leaving that spare key where I could find it and forgetting that his carefully constructed lies would eventually collide with reality. 6 months later, Ryan pled guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He lost his job, his professional reputation, and any hope of the custody battle he'd been planning to wage against me. Grace moved to another city to escape the scandal and start over with her life. And I began the long process of rebuilding everything Ryan had destroyed. The divorce was finalized while Ryan was in prison, and I was awarded full custody of Chloe along with the right to pursue civil action to recover the money he'd stolen. My interior design business actually grew during this period, as word spread about my situation and other women in similar circumstances sought out my services. Apparently, there's something powerful about hiring someone who's proven she can rebuild her life from the ground up. Chloe struggled with her father's betrayal and imprisonment, but she also learned important lessons about honesty, integrity, and the importance of building relationships based on trust rather than convenience. She's 16 now and one of the strongest, most resilient people I know. She visits Ryan occasionally, but she's also clear-eyed about who he really is and what he chose to do to our family. As for me, I eventually learned to trust again, though it took time and patience. I'm in a relationship now with a man named Thomas who's a widower and father of 2. Thomas knows my entire story, and he's never made me feel like my past trauma is something he needs to fix or overcome. He simply loves me as I am, complicated history and all. The apartment on Maple Street was eventually rented to a young couple starting their life together. Sometimes I drive by it when I'm in that part of town, and I think about how that small brass key changed the trajectory of my entire life. It opened a door that killed my marriage, but it also freed me from a relationship that was built on lies and manipulation. Ryan is scheduled to be released next year, and he's already sent letters through his attorney asking about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship and our family. I've made it clear that while I wish him well in his efforts to rebuild his life, there's no going back to what we had before. Some betrayals are too complete, some lies too elaborate, and some trust too thoroughly broken to ever be repaired. The spare key that I found in Ryan's suit pocket didn't just open the door to his secret apartment. It opened the door to a truth that was painful but necessary, and ultimately, it opened the door to a life that's built on honesty, authenticity, and the kind of love that doesn't require lies to sustain itself. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened, even if it takes time to understand why. That key killed my marriage without a sound, but it also saved me from wasting the rest of my life with someone who was never really there to begin with. And in the end, that silence, the quiet click of a lock opening to reveal the truth, was exactly what I needed to hear.